The air in the barracks was stale, thick with the scent of antiseptic and defeat. Ethan figured 4 steps were all it took to fly. First, the paracord. Second, loop it over the exposed steel pipe overhead. Third, the neck. Fourth, kick away the footlocker. He was just contemplating the gentle sway when the door slammed open with a concussive blast. Marcus stormed in, his face a thundercloud. He bellowed, wanting to know what in the hell Ethan thought he was doing. A boot caught Ethan squarely in the ribs before he could answer. Coughing, Ethan curled on the dusty floor. The wind knocked out of him. He managed a pained rasp, asking if a gentler approach was too much to ask for. He'd been in the middle of a delicate operation. Marcus told him to get up and stop being a pathetic washout. A little more of that nonsense and he'd be seeing his ancestors. He wondered if Ethan had any fight left in him at all. Ethan just smiled up at him, a hollow, weary expression. He explained that there wasn't much choice. The base's team of guides had spent a full day with him yesterday, a joint consultation that ended with the collective advice to just accept his new reality. Not everyone could handle the vertigo of plummeting from the apex of the S-class down to the dregs of B-. He, for one, couldn't. Marcus scoffed, asking if that was a good reason to give himself a vertical promotion to the afterlife. He knelt, shoving a datapad into Ethan's view. He told him to cut the dramatics. He had good news. A top-tier S-class guide was inbound from the capital, specifically requesting Ethan as a patient. Someone from the Croft family. He urged Ethan to give it a shot. Ethan's gaze fell on the file. A Croft. In the world of guides, that name was synonymous with dynastic power and unparalleled talent. It also meant they were usually snatched up by elite units stationed in fortified cities, not deployed to godforsaken outposts like this one in the middle of the scorched plains. He looked at the photograph of a man named Julian Croft. Cool, detached, with an intelligent but severe look. Ethan couldn't fathom why someone like that would come to this wasteland. He wondered what the angle was. He had no money, no influence. All he had left was a life that wasn't even worth much. He figured Julian was probably a family reject, some black sheep sent out to the frontier to build a portfolio by fixing a high-profile case like his. He imagined the man would probably have him drooling and docile by the end of it, a perfect success story. He shook his head, refusing. He wanted his cord back. Marcus watched him for a long moment before agreeing. To Ethan's surprise, his captain said fine, he could have it. But as Ethan reached for the cord, Marcus moved like lightning, using it to bind Ethan's wrists. Ethan roared, cursing his captain's name and demanding to be released. He struggled, but Marcus was an A-class sentinel, his physical strength dwarfing Ethan's current diminished state. Thrown over a shoulder like a sack of grain, Ethan was unceremoniously hauled to Julian Croft's new clinic. Marcus dumped him into a chair, informing the man who was reading a book that the package had been delivered. He warned Julian that Ethan had a foul temper and shouldn't be coddled, then offered his best wishes. Julian Croft looked up from his book and gave a slight nod. He expressed his thanks and requested that Captain Marcus leave them. His cool eyes swept over Ethan, a gaze that lingered with a strange intensity. He needed to speak with his patient alone. There was an unsettling quality to Julian's stare. It was a look Ethan couldn't quite place, but it reminded him of how he used to observe creatures in the Blight Zones. An unnerving mix of keen interest and predatory ambition. Then Julian adjusted his glasses, and the feeling vanished, leaving Ethan to wonder if he'd imagined it. Julian began to read from the datapad, his voice a calm monotone. He recited Ethan's history, formerly an S-class sentinel, spirit entity a timber wolf, suffered acute stress displacement after entering a unique Devourer-class Blight Zone. He noted the catastrophic drop in synergy with his spirit entity, landing his current assessment at B-. The incident had been a slaughter. 3 squads had gone in. Only Ethan had made it out, dragged back from the edge by his wolf, a shadow of his former self. He'd been reassigned to Marcus's unit to live out his days. Ethan sneered, telling Julian he could see the difficulty of the case now. He suggested Julian untie him so they could go their separate ways. He had a date with a pipe, and Julian could find another patient. Julian informed him that he had only requested one. He rose from his desk and stood over Ethan, a commanding presence. Ethan noticed then that Julian wasn't built like a typical guide, slight and delicate. His frame was nearly as tall and broad as a sentinel's, just leaner with less overt muscle. A surprisingly handsome face, too, Ethan begrudgingly admitted. Julian ordered him to summon his spirit entity. Ethan looked away, shrugging as best he could with his hands tied. He claimed the wolf didn't listen to him anymore. Calling it out might mean he couldn't get it back in. He couldn't guarantee what would happen. Julian made a sound of impatience, a sharp click of his tongue, and simply repeated the command. Fine, Ethan thought. If the blue blood wanted to see a rabid dog, he'd show him one. With a flicker of concentration, a great black wolf materialized in the room. It let out a magnificent howl that was immediately undercut by its wretched appearance. Its fur was matted and coarse, its limbs so faint they were nearly translucent, the telltale sign of an entity on the verge of dissipation. The wolf spotted Julian and emitted a low growl, its paws scraping against the sterile floor as it readied to pounce. Ethan felt a grim satisfaction, advising the esteemed guide to keep his distance unless he wanted to get mauled. Julian let out a cold laugh and snapped his fingers. A cloying, chilling presence flooded the room. The air seemed to tear open as several thick, glistening tentacles emerged from nowhere, followed by the massive head of a colossal octopus. Its flat, alien pupils radiated an indescribable dread. Before this behemoth, Ethan's wolf looked like a pup. Its threatening growl turned into a whimper as it tucked its tail, looking for a place to hide. Julian gave a one-word command. Go. A tentacle shot out with impossible speed. As the entity's master, Ethan's senses were linked to his wolf's. He felt the crushing pressure of the limb wrapping around it, followed by another, stranger sensation. He gasped out a breathless, mocking question, asking if Julian's octopus always got so handsy on a first date. Wasn't this moving a bit fast? As if in punishment for his words, the octopus's grip tightened, its movements becoming more invasive. Ethan could feel a flush creeping up his neck, spreading across his chest. Julian watched his reaction with detached curiosity. He explained it was merely a method of stimulating the spirit entity to improve synergy. He produced a small vial and poured its contents into Ethan's mouth. He promised, with no sincerity whatsoever, that he would be gentle. The liquid intensified everything. It was clear to Ethan now that every word out of this man's mouth was a lie. He gasped, asking if there wasn't a more dignified way to do this. Julian replied that there were 2 primary methods, one based on pleasure, the other on pain. He added that he was sure Ethan would not want to choose the latter. Ethan choked out that he'd rather be in agony than endure this. He insisted on the pain. Julian sighed, a soft, theatrical sound. He conceded. The tentacles released the wolf, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan felt relief. Then, in the next instant, a tentacle slammed directly into the wolf's head, a brutal, piercing intrusion. Ethan's breath hitched. A scream was strangled in his throat before it could form. A supernova of pain erupted in his mind, causing his body to convulse violently. The world spun, a vortex threatening to crush him. Through the haze, he saw Julian calmly walk over and undo his bonds. He no longer had the strength to stand. His body slid from the chair to the floor. Julian shone a penlight into his eyes, then snapped his fingers again. The tentacles slowly withdrew. But before Ethan could even draw a full breath, the assault began anew, the octopus's limbs now caressing and stroking the wolf. The rapid, jarring switch between excruciating pain and overwhelming pleasure made his brain feel like it was short-circuiting. Fireworks of confused sensation exploded behind his eyes. He curled into a ball, whimpering, his body trembling uncontrollably. This man was a maniac, a complete and utter madman. Julian knelt beside him and gently wiped a tear from his cheek. He advised Ethan to be more obedient next time. A technician at the medbay handed Ethan the new report, commenting that synergy had increased from 30 to 50%. He remarked that Guidecroft's methods were certainly effective. Ethan took the datapad, unsure what to say. He couldn't bring himself to feel grateful. Days earlier, he had been nearly unmade by the man. When Julian had finally declared the session over, Ethan's clothes had been plastered to his skin, drenched in sweat. Julian had even asked if he needed help bathing. Ethan had told him to get lost, wishing him a sudden and unpleasant demise. And yet, the results were miraculous. A 20% increase in a single session was unheard of. In his spiritual sea, the wolf was resting, and Ethan could feel that its form was more solid, more real. The gnawing fear of fading into nothingness had receded. He left the medbay in a daze. Marcus met him in the hallway, clapping him on the shoulder and peering at the report. He grinned, asking if he hadn't told him it would work. Ethan choked out that it had, but the process was, he couldn't find the words. It was too humiliating. To lie on the floor, weeping and drooling while someone calmly observed and took notes. He had never felt so utterly powerless. Marcus did a double take. He walked a circle around Ethan, marveling that he had actually been crying. He was astonished, saying that Julian Croft was something else. He hadn't just healed Ethan. He'd turned a hardened cynic into a mess of tears. Ethan shot him a glare and told him to shut up. Marcus laughed, amending his statement. It seemed he'd turned him into an idiot. Marcus insisted he book his next appointment immediately, but Ethan flatly refused. Marcus stroked his chin, thinking. He suggested that Ethan could apply for a reconnaissance mission in a low-level blight zone. He explained that even with only 50% synergy, Ethan's innate talent put him at the top of the B class. Synergy could be improved through cooperative combat. It was a slower process, but it worked. Ethan's spirits lifted at the idea. It was true. In his old elite squad, such methods weren't necessary, but for regular teams with fewer resources, it was a common way for sentinels to grind their way back to strength. He immediately went to sign up. The night his application was approved, Ethan slept soundly for the first time in months. He dreamed of being fully restored, of encountering Julian Croft again and giving him nothing but the cold shoulder. The next morning, however, as he arrived at the assembly point, his optimism evaporated. Julian was there, a dark look on his face and a smirk playing on his lips. He asked where Ethan thought he was running off to. Ethan was reminded of some trashy romance novel his neighbor's kid used to read. With a line about a desperate chase and no escape, he felt a tremor of fear in his legs. He tried to stand tall, asking what Julian was doing there. Marcus poked his head out from the transport vehicle. He explained that Julian had registered Ethan as a special patient under his direct guardianship, giving him the authority to accompany them. The base command had approved it. Julian held up a form, the proficiency assessment section stamped with a large, bold pass. Ethan's world crumbled. To back out now would be desertion. He numbly climbed into the armored transport. Julian sat beside him, calmly looking out at the passing desert landscape. Ethan shifted away, trying to create as much distance as possible. Suddenly, a hand rested on his thigh. Julian's voice was quiet but laced with an undeniable pressure. He asked why Ethan had missed his second scheduled treatment today. Ethan glanced at the other squad members, forcing a weak smile. He claimed he forgot. Julian didn't press the issue and removed his hand, simply stating that he was not to be late again. Ethan nodded vigorously while mentally cursing the man's entire family tree. He resolved to get his synergy tested the moment they returned. Any improvement would be grounds to petition for a change in treatment methods. Then he'd see who had the last laugh. The silence in the transport was heavy until it finally rolled to a stop before a derelict ghost town. Marcus gave a hand signal, and the team disembarked, fanning out along the deserted main street. Julian stuck close to Ethan. Missions in low-grade zones were typically search and rescue, with some minor cleanup of contaminants. But after sweeping through several buildings, they found nothing. The entire town was empty. Ethan radioed the others, asking if they'd found any survivors. The responses were all negative. Not a single living thing. Marcus ordered everyone to regroup in the town square. The mood was grim. A hot wind rustled through piles of debris, the sound only amplifying the town's desolate emptiness. Marcus summoned his spirit entity, a Harris's hawk, deciding to get an aerial view. He closed his eyes, sharing the hawk's vision. Suddenly, the hawk faltered, spiraling down from the sky. At the same moment, the blight level meter in Ethan's hand began to shriek, its needle spiking wildly, approaching the values of a high-grade zone. Marcus grunted, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. He yelled that there was something wrong with the wind, ordering an immediate retreat. Ethan called his wolf, pulling the injured Marcus onto its back. Not everyone's entity could be used as a mount, but his was strong enough. Julian's octopus was even better. One of its massive tentacles swept up the rest of the team. The wind howled in their ears as they fled. Lying low on the wolf's back, Ethan felt his heartbeat begin to sync with the animals. This was it, a chance to boost his synergy. He urged the wolf to run faster. Behind him, Julian shouted his name, telling him to stop. Ethan ignored him, drunk on the exhilarating rush of power that reminded him of his S-Class days. His connection with the wolf deepened, his consciousness merging with it until he could feel every muscle, every sinew. As their minds became one, a savage, alien roar echoed in his head. He realized with dawning horror that he wasn't syncing with the wolf. It was consuming him. The wolf broke free from his mental control, leaping high into the air and throwing both him and Marcus from its back. A tentacle shot past, catching Ethan before he hit the ground. Marcus wasn't so lucky. He was too far away for Julian to reach in time and landed hard, his abdomen impaled on a rusted piece of rebar. Rage and terror ripped through Ethan. His teeth bared in an involuntary snarl, and a guttural howl tore from his own throat. It was over. He hadn't even secured a decent burial plot. He'd be left to rot in the wilderness. He turned his head, his vision blurring, and saw Julian's stricken face. He managed to force out the words, apologizing and begging Julian to kill him. In this state, there were only two outcomes. He would be killed or his spirit entity would be killed, leaving him a mindless husk. Either way, he wanted to die as a human. Julian seemed to choose the latter. A tentacle shot toward the wolf, Ethan braced himself for the psychic agony of his spirit's destruction. But faster than the pain came Julian's command, projected directly into his mind. "Ethan, shut down your senses." Just before he struck the wolf, Julian plunged him into a silent, dreamless dark. When Ethan awoke, they were miles outside the town. Somehow, Julian had managed to subdue the wolf, leaving it barely alive and forcing it back into the confines of his spiritual sea, preserving his sanity. Julian was sitting beside him, his arm in a makeshift sling. A wave of guilt washed over Ethan. He whispered an apology, saying it was all his fault. Julian's lips were a thin line. He shook his head, admitting that he had pushed too hard, that he had frightened him. Later, Ethan asked about the others. Julian reported that everyone had escaped with minor injuries, except for Marcus, who was still unconscious. Ethan went to see him. Marcus was feverish, his brow furrowed in a deep, pained frown. If Julian hadn't used his entity's viscous fluids to seal the wound, Marcus would have bled out. The other team members recounted what had happened. They said Julian had made his octopus swell to 3 times its normal size, forming a living wall that shielded them from the bizarre wind, buying them the time they needed to escape. One of them told him with awe that the back of the octopus had been shredded to pieces, but Julian hadn't even flinched. Ethan's heart ached at the thought. The psychic feedback from that kind of injury would have been agonizing, a continuous torment. He couldn't bring himself to look Julian in the eye. Julian, Marcus, they were both hurt because of his recklessness. And worse, he had undone all of Julian's work. He doubted his synergy was even at 10% now. When they returned to base, he'd surely be discharged. A suffocating tightness gripped his chest. He fled the medbay, only to be caught in a firm embrace. Julian held him close, his hand gently patting his back. He told Ethan that as long as they were alive, there was always a chance. He said the town would be quarantined for now, but when a new expiation was organized, Ethan could submit a request to join and get his revenge. Ethan's voice was thick with despair. He said there was no chance, not with his synergy gone. Julian looked at him intently, promising that no matter how low it dropped, he had ways to bring it back up. He guaranteed it. The mention of his ways made Ethan shudder involuntarily. Julian's lips curved into a faint, low smile. He confessed that their first session had been intentionally severe. He knew Ethan's temperament. Without a dramatic demonstration of results, he would never have cooperated. Ethan was momentarily speechless. He had to admit, if Julian had calmly explained that his treatment involved being violated by a spiritual octopus, he would have reported him as a pervert and ensured he was sent back to the capital in disgrace. Julian took his hand, his voice softening. He promised that from now on, as long as Ethan cooperated, he would be truly gentle. Ethan asked cautiously just how gentle he meant. Julian's eyes glinted. He'd find out in a few days. Julian was gone for 3 days along with Marcus. Once Marcus was stable, the base launched an official inquiry into the mission failure. Logically, Ethan was at fault, but Julian took full responsibility, stating that as Ethan's designated guardian, the failure was his. His method of atonement was to personally oversee Marcus's recovery, a process that elevated him from A-class to a full-fledged S-class sentinel. The day their treatment concluded, Ethan went to the clinic to meet them. Marcus burst out first, bouncing around like an uncaged animal, demanding everyone address him as the invincible Whirlwind S-class sentinel. Julian emerged behind him, looking utterly exhausted. He quietly told Ethan that he had used the pain-based therapy on Marcus. Ethan looked at his friend, who seemed perfectly cheerful. Julian explained that Marcus had been screaming and rolling on the floor, vowing to flay him alive, so he'd given him a little psychic jolt to quiet him down. The intense stimulus triggered a protective amnesia. Ethan asked if he wasn't afraid Marcus would remember. Julian replied that the brain's self-preservation instinct would likely ensure he never did. Ethan thought that Julian should have used that trick on him. Julian's expression turned wry. He said that if Ethan had chosen pain, he would have made sure he remembered every last second of it. A shiver went down Ethan's spine. The man was unhinged. Marcus bounded over, clapping Ethan on the back. He raved that his personal guy Julian was the real deal. He felt like he'd blinked and woken up as an S-class. He told Ethan to hurry up and get better so they could form a legendary duo and dominate the annual skills competition. As Ethan started to nod, Julian's arm slid around his waist, pulling him close. He informed Marcus that Ethan was already on his team. Marcus, nonplussed, just grinned and said he wouldn't get in the way of them being a couple, then bounded off to find another partner. After he left, Ethan turned to Julian, raising an eyebrow at the term couple. Julian, without a trace of a blush, stated that they were bonded now. It was true in a way, but there was a significant difference between a partner and a lover. Fatigue had softened Julian's sharp edges. He leaned against Ethan, resting his head on his shoulder. He asked to be taken back to his quarters, murmuring that he would show Ethan his gentle side. The man who intended to demonstrate his gentleness found himself pinned to his own bed. He raised an eyebrow, asking if Ethan was that eager. Ethan told him to shut up. He said what Julian needed most was rest. His dark circles were so pronounced he looked like he was practicing for Halloween. As he spoke, a tentacle snaked out from under the covers and wrapped around his leg. Julian's voice was soft, telling him not to leave. The tentacle's suction cups gave a playful, light pop against his ankle. Ethan's resolve softened. After all, this was his fault. He tucked the blanket around Julian, promising he wouldn't go anywhere. Satisfied, Julian closed his eyes. While he slept, Ethan decided to tidy up his quarters. The living area was cluttered with unpacked boxes. It was clear he had moved in hastily and been too busy to settle. Ethan spent some time organizing, then checked the refrigerator and decided to cook. As he was finishing the last dish, Julian appeared, awake and still drowsy, wrapping his arms around him from behind. He murmured into his ear that he was wonderful. Ethan shuddered, telling him to act normal because he was creeping him out. Julian just chuckled, asking why he hadn't pushed him away then. His hand gave Ethan's backside a quick squeeze. Ethan yelped, slapping at his hand and telling him he was getting way too bold. Julian ignored him, reverting to his cool, aristocratic demeanor as he sat down to eat. Throughout the meal, Ethan kept stealing glances at him. The calmer Julian appeared, the more nervous Ethan became. He couldn't believe the man would actually be gentle. Julian shot him a cool look from across the table and asked if he was finished. Ethan nodded nervously. Julian dabbed his mouth with a napkin with infuriating slowness. He observed that Ethan seemed quite fidgety and anticipatory, suggesting they might as well begin now. Before Ethan could protest that he was not anticipating anything, he felt a soft chime in his spiritual sea. A deep, resonant tone washed through the gloomy corners of his mind. An octopus slipped in silently, finding the black wolf curled up in a withered patch of grass. Unlike the last time, its approach was not that of a predator. The tentacles touched the wolf with impossible softness, a gentle caress that coaxed it from its slumber into a rising tide of pleasure. Sharing the wolf's senses, Ethan was carried away on the same current, reaching a psychic crescendo almost instantly. When he opened his eyes, Julian was watching him, a slight curl to his lips as he asked how it was. Ethan, boneless on the sofa, managed a hoarse, one-word reply. Not bad. Julian nodded in satisfaction. He came over, cupped Ethan's face in his hands, and kissed him. Ethan's eyes widened. He pushed him away in a mild panic, asking if this was also part of the treatment. Julian stated it was his personal preference. Ethan hugged himself, feeling helpless. He pointed out that Julian had already gotten what he wanted on a spiritual level. Wasn't that enough? Julian blinked innocently. He explained that he had a defect. He couldn't share senses with his spirit entity. As he spoke, he pressed a knee firmly between Ethan's legs. He concluded that, unfortunately, Ethan would have to accommodate him on both the spiritual and physical planes. This was a complete abuse of power. Ethan started to protest, to say he would file a complaint, but a sudden tremor silenced him, turning his words into a soft gasp. He pleaded with Julian not to touch him there. Julian's voice was a low murmur, asking where he meant. Here or here? Ethan could only weakly push against him, calling him a bastard between quiet laughs. As Julian's hands and mouth worked their magic, Ethan found, to his dismay, that the man was remarkably skilled. He found himself begging to be taken to the bedroom. Julian's eyes crinkled at the corners. He agreed, saying whatever Ethan wanted. When it was all over, Ethan lay staring at the ceiling. A bona fide sentinel topped by a guide. If Marcus and the others ever found out, he'd never live it down. Julian, in contrast, was in high spirits. He brought in a bowl of oatmeal and tried to feed him like a child. Ethan turned his head away, telling him to hand it over so he could feed himself. Surprisingly, Julian agreed, holding out the bowl. But as Ethan reached for it, he found his hands tangled in unseen limbs. He yelled, asking what kind of trick this was, demanding Julian retract his damn tentacles. Julian calmly placed a spoonful of oatmeal in his mouth, informing him it was the special ability of having an octopus as his spirit entity. And so, Ethan voluntarily finished the entire bowl. Julian brushed the hair from his forehead, telling him to rest while he washed the dishes. Ethan stopped him. He asked about what Julian had said earlier about not being able to sync with his entity. He recalled that was considered a major disability among guides. Julian looked at him, his expression placid. He stated it was true. He was the Croft family's defective product. After a pause, he asked if Ethan minded. In a family as ruthless as the Crofts, all defects were disposed of. Their centuries-old reputation as a premier guide lineage allowed no room for imperfection. Ethan had heard rumors about the disposal method. They were exiled to a remote island to fend for themselves, a place of scarce resources and brutal conditions. He couldn't imagine someone as refined and proud as Julian enduring such a place. Julian's gaze was steady, as if he were discussing something trivial, but Ethan noticed the slight tremor in his fingers. He looked down, a self-deprecating smile touching his lips, and said he would go do the dishes. Ethan told him he didn't mind. He swung his aching body off the bed and stood before him. He said that Julian's technique was excellent, and that it didn't matter if he couldn't sync with his entity. He was an S-class guide regardless. To become an S-class despite being a defect made him stronger than any other Croft. Julian's eyes glistened. He looked at Ethan for a long moment, his throat working, before pulling him into a fierce hug. Ethan hugged him back, sensing a vulnerability he'd never seen before. He asked Julian to tell him about his past. Julian wasn't born a defect. Initial tests revealed he possessed the talents of both a guide and a sentinel, a once-in-a-century prodigy. His grandfather had seen immense potential in him, even tolerating his unconventional octopus entity. But they soon discovered the conflicting talents were a curse, not a gift. While Julian could command his entity, he felt no sensory feedback from it. This meant his bond with it was tenuous. It could turn on and consume him at any moment. More critically, when healing others, he had to rely solely on theory and experience, unable to adapt instinctively to a patient's unique spiritual landscape. The night the final assessment came in, he was exiled from the Croft estate. His younger brother, who just the day before had trailed after him adoringly, threw his luggage on the ground and kicked it, sneering that trash belonged in the junkyard. The beautiful life he had known shattered like glass. Julian became the most sullen resident of the island of outcasts. Years later, rising sea levels and a surge in blight factors overwhelmed the island. The exiles fled to the shore, begging passing ships for rescue. No one dared to pick up a reject abandoned by the Croft family. Julian simply lay on his cot, watching a moth trapped in a spiderweb on the ceiling, waiting to die. But someone had dared. Ethan, returning from a mission, passed the island. Ignoring the protests of his crew, he rode his black wolf ashore in a single powerful leap. In those days, he was one of the top 10 sentinels in the Federation. No one could stop him. He found Julian and unceremoniously hauled him to his feet. Seeing the lifeless look in his eyes, Ethan tapped his cheek. He asked if Julian could hear him. When there was no response, he leaned in and shouted directly into his ear that as long as you were alive, there was always a chance. Julian had shoved his face away, expressionless, and muttered that he could hear just fine, and that he was too loud. That day, Julian's dead heart began to beat again, all because of Ethan. After his rescue, he vowed to overcome his defect and become the strongest guide, so he could stand by Ethan's side and be the only one Ethan ever saw. His talent and determination eventually forced the Croft family to acknowledge him again. But just as he was ready, news came from the frontier outpost. Ethan was broken, his spirit entity collapsing. He was on the verge of madness. Ignoring his family's objections, Julian had left for the outpost that very night. He had arrived just in time, just as some idiot was about to hang himself from a pipe, and had Marcus kick some sense into him. As Julian finished his story, Ethan quietly protested that he wasn't an idiot. Julian retorted that he was. What sane person used their neck for a swing? Ethan grinned. Yours does. A faint blush crept up the tips of Julian's ears. He cleared his throat and conceded the point. Ethan threw his arms out magnanimously, declaring that since Julian was so deeply devoted to him, he would graciously consent to be his bonded partner. Julian deadpanned that he was truly grateful. Ethan waved a hand dismissively, telling his humble servant not to mention it. He then yelped as a tentacle snaked out from behind Julian. He clutched his chest protectively, demanding to know what he was doing. A tentacle had already slipped under his shirt. Julian smiled, saying he was just going to show him how deep that devotion could run. Ethan wailed that it wasn't necessary, he'd already seen it yesterday. But with only 2 hands against Julian's 10 limbs, resistance was futile. He protested that he had a synergy test scheduled, that he was going to be late. Julian calmly tapped a few commands into his wrist terminal, informing him that the appointment had been postponed. He told the med bay they needed another consolidation session. His fingers traced a path of fire over Ethan's skin as his protests and gasps were smothered by a kiss. With his full cooperation, the bonding application was approved swiftly. Ethan officially moved out of the barracks and into Julian's quarters. Marcus volunteered to help with the move. He stripped off his shirt, ready to lift boxes, then did a double take looking at Ethan. He asked if he wasn't hot in that long-sleeved shirt, and before Ethan could react, he lifted the hem. Marcus let out a low whistle. Ethan, mortified, wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He told Marcus to shut his mouth. Marcus, looking genuinely confused, asked where he'd found a cupping therapist with such good technique. Ethan called him an idiot. Marcus grumbled, asking why he was so touchy about a simple question. The cupping therapist himself came upstairs, holding Marcus's shirt. He told the captain he could handle it from here and suggested he put his shirt back on. With a snap of his fingers, the octopus got to work, its efficiency making four of Marcus look slow. Marcus watched, impressed, remarking that he needed to find himself a guide with an octopus or a squid. Ethan gave him a look of profound pity, silently wishing him luck in his future, very colorful nightlife. Once Marcus left, Julian wrapped his arms around Ethan, his breath warm against his ear. Finally, they were alone. Ethan pushed at his wandering hands, pointing out that this behavior was rather out of character. He asked if Julian remembered his initial cool and aloof persona. Julian countered that a cool exterior didn't necessarily mean a cool interior. Ethan's smart mouth got the better of him. He mused that no matter how cool a man was on the outside, he was warm somewhere else, and that maybe he should get a chance to be on top sometime. To his surprise, Julian agreed. That night, he made good on his promise. He lay on the bed, holding Ethan's hips. He praised the lovely curve of his waist and urged him to push down harder. Ethan, trapped and blushing, whined that Julian was a bastard. In the second year of their partnership, Ethan's power returned to its S-class peak. Julian, in turn, became the most sought-after guide on the base. The chief requested he hold a weekly public clinic. He agreed, but after a short while, no one signed up for his sessions anymore. The consensus was that his treatments were effective, even pleasant. Patients felt like they just had a good nap and woke up cured. But for some reason, the sight of him afterward filled them with a vague, inexplicable sense of dread. Julian would feign innocence, and with no patience, he was free to spend all his time with Ethan. They returned to the ghost town together and discovered the strange wind was a swarm of mutated insects. This time, Ethan's speed far outstripped theirs, and his wolf's claws tore them to shreds in minutes. They also entered the annual skills competition. In the doubles final, they faced Marcus and his new partner, who, just as he'd wished, was a guide with a squid entity. Seeing Ethan, Marcus was overjoyed. During the prep time, Ethan couldn't resist asking him how his cupping therapist's technique was. Marcus's jaw tightened. He ground out that it was, in any case, better than his. The comment ignited a fire on the field. The animosity between Julian and the squid guide was palpable. The other guide tried to trap Julian's octopus in a spike pit, hoping the shared pain would incapacitate him. But he didn't know Julian couldn't feel it. Julian's entity moved without hesitation, and in the end, he used his own defect to his advantage, slamming the squid into its own trap with a single brutal blow. The other guide nearly passed out from the psychic backlash. Even a flaw could be a weapon of glory. To celebrate their victory, Ethan had prepared a cake. Julian was halfway through his slice when he stopped, pulling a ring from his mouth. He stared at it, the first truly dumbfounded expression Ethan had ever seen on his face. Ethan waved a hand in front of his eyes, then leaned in close and yelled, "Julian Croft, marry me." This time he didn't push his head away. A deep blush spread across his face as he murmured that he was too loud. His eyes, fixed on the ring, grew moist. His voice was barely a whisper. "Ethan, you have to be sure. My possessiveness is very strong." Ethan knew. He gave him a mock glare, asking if he thought his own wasn't. He said if he didn't lock him down soon, he wouldn't be able to sleep at night. Julian couldn't help but laugh, a laugh that soon gave way to tears. The dying boy on the island had finally escaped the spider's web. He had become the spider himself, and he had caught the one he loved. He kissed Ethan with a reverence that stole his breath, then placed Ethan's hand over his own heart. He told him to feel the rhythm, a rhythm that beat every single moment, only for him. "I am your guide," he said, "and you are the conductor of my life."